Hello guys, welcome to the first lesson of the CSS-Grid bite-sized tutorial, and in this lesson we're going to be finding out what CSS-Grid is, and we're also going to be learning some important terminology you need to know before getting started on using the grid system. So first things first guys, what is CSS-Grid? So the CSS-Grid layout, or sometimes referred to as just grid, is a two-dimensional grid-based layout system which has the primary aim of completely changing the way we design grid-based user interfaces. Now historically the role of CSS has always been used to lay out our web pages, but it's never really done a very good job of this. So firstly we use tables, and then we use floats, and then position, and then inline block. But all of these methods are essentially just cheat codes and hacks, and they left out quite a lot of important functionality, so things like vertical centering. Now Flexbox came along and did help, but as you can see in this example, it's intended for simpler one-dimensional layouts, and you can only either choose to flex items in either the row or the column. Now Grid has taken this even further and is now two-dimensional and can handle both rows and columns. But I just want to add guys that you shouldn't really see Flexbox and Grid as enemies. They do in fact work very well together. There are instances where Flexbox is more suitable, and likewise with Grid. So before diving into the VS Code guys and seeing CSS Grid in action, it's important to understand some important terminology. First things first guys, you've got the grid container and the grid items, and the way this is laid out in your HTML is similar to Flexbox. So you'll have a div which has got a class of grid container or an ID of grid container, which is of course going to act as your grid container. And once that's initiated, as you can see here in the style sheet with a display value of grid instead of flex, all the items in here will now become grid items. So next we've got grid lines, and grid lines are basically just the dividing lines that make up the structure of a grid, and they can either be vertical, so in columns like 1, 2, 3, 4 here, or in a row horizontally as 1, 2, 3, 4. Now understanding grid lines is pretty fundamental to understanding the grid system. So say for example we wanted our content to span across 3 columns here. We'd need to start our grid line at 1 and then 2, 3, 4. So it's spanning across 3. It's not spanning on 3 because then that would only be spanning across 2. So this may be a bit confusing at first, but once you grasp this concept of grid lines, learning the grid is pretty simple. So next we have grid cell. Now a good way of looking at grid cells is kind of liking it to an Excel spreadsheet, and in Excel spreadsheets there's individual cells, and it's similar in this case really. So this cell here, which is coloured yellow, is a single block or a unit of the grid. Next we have grid track. Now this is just the space between 2 adjacent grid lines, and you can think of them like columns or rows of the grid. So the grid track in this instance is between the first and third row grid lines. And then lastly we have grid area, and what we could do is essentially define a whole area which consists of multiple grid cells, but this only works in squares and rectangles, so you can't have things like triangles. But that'll be it for this video guys. If you do like the content, please consider hitting the like button, and please consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next video where we're going to be learning about the properties of the grid container.